What's up, everybody? Nick Whalen and Jim Coventry here with you. This is the RotoWire Fantasy Football Pod. Talking tight ends today as we continue our positional tier. Oh, what am I talking about, Jim? As we continue our positional preview series here from the Circa Resort and Casino out in Las Vegas. It is contest weekend. It's your last chance. Well, kind of your last chance. You got up until week one to get in your Circa Survivor and your Circa Millions entries, but we implore everybody to do it. It's a great contest. We're talking 16 mil, Jim, in terms of guaranteed prizes between the two contests. And we'll tell you right away, Circa is a presenting sponsor of our program, the biggest pro football contest in Vegas back this season. Circa Survivor and Circa Million, up to 16 million in guaranteed prizes. Two ways to win, no rate. Circa Survivor contestants, you know how to play Survivor. You select one team each week, no point spread. Last the longest, and you win it all. $10 million guaranteed in Circa Survivor. In Circa Million, make 5 picks against the spread each week for your share of $6 million guaranteed. Quarterly and full season payouts are part of the contest. So get off to a bad start, like I may have last season, Jim. You're still playing for something, right? Enter in Nevada, play from anywhere. Visit circasports.com for details. All right, Jim, let's talk some tight ends, maybe. We'll start right at the top. We won't hit every single player name by name, but when we're talking about the tight end, it's a little bit smaller than running backs or wide receivers. You're oftentimes rostering just two tight ends in a lot of standard leagues. Sam, Travis Kelce, Trey McBride, Mark Andrews, that's kind of your top tier of tight ends. Kincaid's toward the end of that as well. But I want to ask you just overall, you've done a ton of drafts. I've done a ton of drafts. How often are you finding yourself going early tight end?
Yeah, I rarely go early tight end. And one thing I want people to understand, yes, last year and years prior, Travis Kelce was like the 104, the 106. And this year, you're paying third round price for the top guys. But really, the top 6 last year were separated by about 30 PPR points. They were very tightly packed. You're not getting a positional advantage by taking one of those early tight ends. So if I get to a point early where I don't like the wide receivers, if the tight end 5 or 6, Mark Andrews or Kyle Pitts are there, I might consider that. Otherwise, I'm more than happy to dig in to the tight end 9, tight end 12, Ferguson, Freiermuth, happy to go there, but I am not reaching high.
Is there a parallel to be drawn here to the quarterback position? Are you also not an early QB guy? Because I think what you mentioned with the tight ends where, there's that top tier, for a reason, but you look at the difference in terms of, total fantasy points per game. Yeah, there's a gap between, Sam Laporta and Evan Ingram and Travis Kelce last season in PPR leagues, even TJ Hawkinson before he got hurt. But, we're ultimately talking about, 1.5 to 2 fantasy points per game. So I think you're right about that. I tend to wait on quarterback. I tend to wait on tight end as well. I want to be loading up on running backs and receivers at that point in the draft. I found myself getting more Mark Andrews than anybody else in that top tier.
Yeah, I have Mark Andrews. We'll talk a little bit about him. He's my tight end too. And if he goes to the tight end 5, I do get tempted at that price. But like you said, with quarterback, I'm with you as well. The 1C positions, and obviously you're drafting in a 12-team league in most situations. Yeah, I'm waiting on both of those positions. As you said, if you look at the way the draft boards usually dry up with wide receivers and running backs, I want to get plenty of the top talent there and then piece together my other rooms of quarterbacks and tight ends. So I'm with you on that approach.
Yeah, and you mentioned an interesting dichotomy, I think, between this season and last season, where we don't have a tight end who goes remotely close to the first round, right? I mean, every now and then, you'll see someone, take Travis Kelce midway or late in the second round. His min pick at the NFFC over the last week is 18. So there are still the Kelce true believers out there, but year to year, the tight end position tends to fluctuate a ton. And I think something we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years specifically, and really the last 2, is the influx of young talent, right? It doesn't feel like it's a position where if you don't get one of the top 3 tight ends, you're on an island, right? That's, when you're drafting back in 2020, 2021, you kind of had that feeling where you're like, man, I really want Kelce. I really want Mark Andrews. And obviously if you're in a 12-team league, only 3 of those guys are going to land one of those players. The depth of the position this season specifically is what really stands out. I mean, you can go really all the way down for me to David Njoku, Brock Bowers, guys who are going outside of the top 100 at the NFFC. And, that's kind of where I draw that line. Njoku and Bowers is kind of the last stand for me. I don't love dipping into Dallas Goedert as my tight end 1. We'll get into TJ Hawkinson later. Pat Freiermuth, Dalton Schultz, that's like the absolute floor if I end up getting locked out at tight end. But, more often than not, I find myself shopping in the Evan Ingram range, the George Kittle range. Jake Ferguson has been my guy. And it's a little bit dangerous, going into a draft saying, all right, I need to get player X in round 7 or round 8, because you have no idea how the draft is going to break. But Jake Ferguson is by far my most owned tight end so far.
Yeah, I was on Ferguson last year. I was scooping him up in the 17th round in early drafts last year, and then by the time the summer ended, it was 13th round. This year, I think he gets better.
Yeah.
That's always targeted the tight end. Ferguson is probably the number 2 option in the Dallas offense, and he's a seam stretcher. And we talk about the different tight ends that you mentioned earlier. The league plays 73% zone defense. Well, how do you attack zones? You find the voids in zones, and those are in the middle of the field. Who is lined up in the middle of the field? The tight end. And that's why we're seeing this resurgence of tight ends where we have a number of players with high floor because it's how you attack the modern NFL defense.
Yeah, no question about that. So let's go back to the top of the board, and we'll kind of piece our way through it tier by tier. If you are going early tight end, are you targeting Kelsey? Are you targeting Laporta? They have almost the exact same ADP, like almost down to the decimal at the NFFC over the last week. You could get Trey McBride about a round later. You'll see Dalton Kincaid in that same range as well. Kincaid's actually overtaken Mark Andrews over the last couple of weeks. And, part of the reason I'm starting to talk myself into Kincaid is a lot of what we just talked about with Ferguson, where you look at the wide receiver cupboard, if you will, in Buffalo, Jim. It's pretty bare.
Yeah, Kincaid could be the number 1 targeted receiver on that team, and that would not be a stretch to say that's going to happen. So there's definitely opportunity in your PPR leagues to make that a priority to get Kincaid. When you mentioned Kelsey earlier, look, Kelsey might be in a better situation than we think. For the last 2 years, the Chiefs did not have an explosive passing attack. Tyreek Hill was gone. Nobody feared Marcus Valdes-Scantling. So safeties would frequently spin down at the snap and gang up Kelsey in the middle of the field. Well, now you bring in Xavier Worthy with super speed, and also at some point Marquise Brown will be healthy, and those 2 elements of speed, they're going to force that second safety to be occupied on the deep end of the field because we know Mahomes is looking to buy time and hunt. What does that mean? That means the middle of the field is more open for Kelsey than it was in the last 2 years. So if you're betting on Kelsey, you're just, it's 34 and injury recovery is a problem, but Kelsey would be the one player that could access ceiling. Laporta had 10 touchdowns last year. He has to match that because his yardage, it was fine. It was 889 yards, but that was not an outlier season. He just caught a year where there was no big tight end performances. That's how he was number 1.
How about Trey McBride? Where does he fit into this for you? I think the price is appropriate. Obviously there's not a ton of target competition in Arizona outside of Marvin Harrison Jr. I mean, that's the big change with this offense this season. But I think, the same argument that, that we made for Travis Kelce, you can make for Trey McBride, right? I think having someone like Marvin Harrison on this roster, does that open things up for Trey McBride? Are there concerns that it takes away from him at all?
Well, the thing with Trey McBride last year was Marquise Brown was hurt. Michael Wilson was hurt. McBride was often the de facto number 1 receiver for plenty of games. And that meant he was seeing 8 targets a game. And now full season, that's 136. McBride's not seeing that level of workload. People are sleeping on Michael Wilson. He has a low ADP. Wilson had 56 or more yards in 5 of his first 8 games with Clayton Tune and Joshua Dobbs. And then when Michael Wilson had a late season injury, his first 2 games he had goose egg because he wasn't healthy. But the last 2 games at Murray, he averaged 65 yards. Michael Wilson is going to be a plus receiver in this league. Marvin Harrison's an alpha. To me, McBride is at best the 2B option in the receiving game, and he's possibly the 3. And last year he was the number 1 option. And I think that he's being drafted as if he still has a chance to see a super high target share. Maybe, but I think Wilson's way more involved than people think.
All right, let's talk some Mark Andrews. Dealing with an undisclosed injury right now. Probably doesn't seem like anything that's going to impact him for week 1, but anytime there's any sort of remote injury scare with Mark Andrews, we're going to be paying attention. That's really what it comes down to for me. If you're talking about drafting Andrews, staying away from him, it is your risk tolerance with the injuries, right? Because I think nobody has been, outside of Travis Kelce, steadier than Mark Andrews when healthy over the last 6 or 7 years. But, he missed 2 games in 2022, obviously missed extensive time last season. Are you willing to incur that risk? Do you find yourself, passing on Mark Andrews, moving down to Kyle Pitts, moving down to Evan Ingram or George Kittle? How willing have you been to buy in on Mark Andrews and take an optimistic view on his health?
Look, the injury narrative on Mark Andrews is ridiculous. There is no injury history. Last year he got hurt. He had a hip drop tackle. Like you said, he had 2 missed games in 2022. People miss time. He didn't miss any games in 2021. He missed 2 in 2020, 1 in 2019. He rarely ever misses time except for last year. But people are treating him as if he's this pariah with injuries. He's never on the field, and that couldn't be further from the truth. He is a lock for 800 plus yards. He is a lock for 7 touchdowns, and he is basically Lamar Jackson's go-to guy. And when Lamar Jackson was improving in this offense from week 12 on, Andrews wasn't there. Andrews walks into a situation where Lamar Jackson is better in this offense than he was with Andrews last year, and I can't wait to see it. Remember, Andrews is one of 5 tight ends to have a 1,000-yard season in the last 5 years. He had 1,300 that year. He won't get that again, but he definitely can get 1,000.
Yeah, Mark Andrews 4th in terms of fantasy points per game last season, and that's counting a partial game in which he got hurt. So I'm with you on Mark Andrews. I think we can agree on the upside, and he makes some good points about the injury, right? I mean, it's been more of these kind of isolated, freak type of injuries for Mark Andrews, and certainly that was the case last season. Before we talk Kyle Pitts, which will be a discussion in and of itself, Jim, I want to tell you about Fantasy Sports Knockout, another presenting sponsor of the podcast. Fantasy Sports Knockout, where a fantasy league meets a knockout pool. It's an innovative take on fantasy football. The concept, it's simple. Choose a new fantasy lineup each week, score points the same way you would in any fantasy league, but you must choose your players wisely. You can only use one player one time. The lowest weekly score or group of scores is eliminated from the contest every week. The concept may be simple, but survival is not. How will you play? Load up early, or play the matchup, save the better players for later. Fantasy Sports Knockout. Can you survive the fantasy? Sign up and play at fantasysportsknockout.com today. Kyle Pitts, Jim. Kyle Pitts, ADP of 67.3 in the NFFC over the last week. That makes him the tight end 6. Are you a believer in Kyle Pitts? And by proxy, are you a believer in the upside of this Falcons offense?
I am a believer. Kyle Pitts was horribly used with Arthur Smith. We saw Jonnu Smith, another tight end in the Atlanta offense, get 582 yards last year. It was criminal, while Kyle Pitts was getting 667 yards himself. But that said, there were a ton of tight end targets. But what was Pitts seeing? He was seeing a 99th percentile average depth of target, which is a super low percentage type of pass. But he was seeing it from the likes of Desmond Ridder and Taylor Heineke. So now you take the lowest percentage play possible and you get it from quarterbacks that do not belong on an NFL field. And how did Kyle Pitts even get 667 yards? I guess it was the 90 targets. Well, now in this new offense, this is a derivative of the Rams offense. Zach Robinson will run this. You have to believe that Pitts is going to be split out from the tight end spot, but weaponized similar to the way the Rams used to weaponize their wide receivers. And I really don't see a world that Kirk Cousins is not getting the ball to Kyle Pitts in optimal scenarios. So look, Pitts has been a disappointment, but this year it could not be a better spot for him.
I'm hesitant to buy in, Jim, but I'm all in on the Kyle Pitts resurgence as well. I actually loaded up on Kyle Pitts shares more so early in draft season, and I've started to diversify a little bit more. But I think you look at what the upside is for Atlanta versus even the other teams in their division, right? Like the Saints, to me, they top out as a 9, maybe a 10-win team. Carolina, to me, they'll be better than last year, but not a whole lot better. And when we're talking about Atlanta, I think they're the only team in that division where they could conceivably see an 11, 12, maybe even 13-win season if everything breaks right. It requires faith in Kirk Cousins staying healthy. I tend to buy into that. My take on this, Jim, is that I think if the Aaron Rodgers situation had not happened last year, I think we'd be a lot less skittish on Kirk Cousins. And that's not to downplay the severity of an Achilles injury, but I think the fact that Rodgers had the same injury and then had what happened to him 3 plays into week 1, there's kind of this thing in the back of your mind of like, well, that could happen to Kirk Cousins. And yes, it could, but it's still to me very unlikely, and I think we can't, much like Aaron Rodgers with the Jets, and this is part of the reason I like Garrett Wilson this year, we cannot overstate the level of upgrade that we're looking at here for Atlanta. The quarterback play for the Falcons last year versus what it could be this year with Kirk Cousins, one of the biggest upgrades in the NFL.
Real quick on Kirk Cousins, the Achilles saps explosiveness. Cousins hasn't been explosive in many years, so I think that we're going to see a situation where he's a pocket passer. This injury will not impact him. The odds of it happening again are very, very small, so I think there's no issue with Cousins.
All right, let's go a little bit further down. Evan Ingram, Jim. I controversially took Evan Ingram over Kyle Pitts in the Scott Fishbowl draft about a month ago out in Boston. And, that's a tight end premium league. You're getting a boost in terms of tight end first downs. You're getting a boost in terms of tight end receptions. There's an argument, certainly, that the volume may not be there at the same level for Evan Ingram as it was last season. And, I think he's in somewhat of a similar case to David Njoku. The people that don't like David Njoku, you say, well, made his bones last year in the second half of the season, when Joe Flacco stepped in. And Evan Ingram, in a somewhat similar situation, it was once Christian Kirk went down, that's when we saw Evan Ingram take off. Evan Ingram did not score a touchdown, Jim, until week 12 against the Cincinnati Bengals, or week 13, excuse me, and ended up with 4 touchdowns over the final 6 games of the season. I think you're likely sacrificing some targets. You're sacrificing some receptions early in the year. But I also think there's some touchdown progression coming from Evan Ingram, and I think he benefits from what I hope and pray as a Jaguars fan will be a more competent, more productive offense overall.
Look, when we look back at Evan Ingram's past seasons, last year, of course, we talked about the end of the season where he had 73 yards per game when Kirk was out. In 2022, 786 yards. It was good. But nonetheless, with Evan Ingram, he was just a PPR floor play until Kirk went out. He was like 10 points a game, which is nice. It was nice of a floor play, but he didn't have more than 13.7 points through week 11 until Kirk got hurt. So I don't see it changing. The role in the offense isn't going to be much different. Brian Thomas comes in, probably takes a lot of what Calvin Ridley has. Christian Kirk's the go-to guy in the offense, and he kind of plays the same position Ingram plays. Ingram's an attached tight end who's a slot. Kirk's a slot, but Kirk's a better player. And I just think ultimately Ingram's going to be a floor play again, but you're not going to get anything big out of him on a consistent basis.
I think there will be the spike weeks, and especially if Christian Kirk or if Brian Thomas or if Gabe Davis go down, I think Evan Ingram is still going to be that guy who has the comfortability level with Trevor Lawrence. But you're right, and I think what's interesting is he finished last year as tight end 2 in PPR in terms of overall points, but you're getting him as a tight end 7. There hasn't been a price hike here. So I think he still makes sense as a floor play, as a guy you can get with the 75th pick in your draft, because nobody's looking at last season necessarily and saying, all right, I need to start drafting Evan Ingram as not even a top 2 or 3 tight end, but not even a top 5 or 6 tight end. So even if you view him as a floor play, you view it as a relatively low ceiling play, I still think the cost is appropriate. Yeah,
definitely. A floor play, there's nothing wrong with that. In your roster construction, sometimes safe is good. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you know what you're getting, then definitely go with that for sure.
Evan Ingram or George Kittle? If you got, let's say you're picking at 75, like I just mentioned, and you want a tight end, which way are you going?
Yeah, I have to go Ingram, because I can't live with a player that I have to put in my lineup every week because I draft him knowing I could get one of those many games, like 3 or fewer receptions in 10 games last year, and yet he goes over 1,000 yards. It's just it's an anomaly that I don't want to deal with. I'd rather have the stability, because with Kittle, you could get that 4 in a playoff game and your season's over. Right. At least with Ingram getting 8 to 11 points, and that kind of helps me move through the playoffs. I have to think through it that way. So yeah, Kittle's volatility is too much.
All right, we'll talk about some tight end values in a moment. We got a message from our friends over at Fantrax. Is there something you wish your fantasy league had, or features that are missing from your current leagues? Maybe bonus scoring, custom schedules, or playoffs, deeper team settings? Well, look no further, because we have you covered with our friends at Fantrax. Fantrax is the most customizable fantasy platform in the industry, offering the greatest fantasy experience for your dynasty, keeper, redraft, and best ball leagues. Fantrax even offers college football fantasy leagues. Create or join a fantasy football commissioner league, invite your friends, and dominate your draft this season. Fantrax is the top dynasty fantasy football platform in the industry. Coming from another service, not a problem. Fantrax can easily import any of your current leagues and rosters. Ever have a trade go wrong or make a mistake dropping a player? Fantrax commissioner tools allow you to undo that move with one simple click. Fantrax is running a special promotion. You don't want to miss it. Right now, you sign up for free at fantrax.com/RotoWire. Do that today. Enter for your chance to win tickets to any regular season NFL game for not only you, Jim, but you and your entire league. Plus, you get $6,000 in spending cash. That's right, tickets for your entire league. Simply create a new league or bring over your existing leagues for more chances to win. Go to fantrax.com/RotoWire and sign up today. It's fantrax.com/RotoWire. Fantrax, the home of fantasy sports. All right, Jim, we're talking tight ends now who go around that pick 100 range. Some of these names are going to be going even later. We're talking, 10th, 11th round values. David Njoku, tight end 10. Brock Bowers, tight end 11. Dallas Goedert, tight end 12 at the NFFC. I wouldn't quite call this a tier, because we are talking 20 picks between Njoku and Goddard. And, some people would lump Njoku closer to the Ingram, Kittle, Ferguson tier. Where do you come in on Njoku? We talked about the way to break down last season in essentially 2 halves, right? One without Deshaun Watson, one with Deshaun Watson. Under the assumption that Deshaun Watson is the quarterback for at least most of the season, how are you valuing Njoku? Yeah,
the first thing we have to get off the top is the 882 yards. Well, we saw the last 4 games of Flacco. Njoku averaged 7 catches, 90 yards, and a touchdown. Those were insane tight end 1 numbers. But the rest of the season, and I know it wasn't just Watson, it was like 4 different quarterbacks, but Njoku only averaged 42 yards a game and 0.6 of a touchdown. Yep. So it was like not even 0.6. No, it was 17% of a touchdown. That was like nothing. So what are we going to get from Njoku? Just go back to 2022. He puts up 628 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 80 targets. That is probably a likely scenario because that end of the season happened last year, but it is not indicative of anything in Njoku's career to that point. The 628 yards puts him right about that tight end 10 to 12 range. But I know they like to use him on screens last year, which was really a nice little addition to that game. But Deshaun Watson is probably unlikely to throw a lot of those short screens because he is a quarterback that tends to look downfield a little bit more. So I think Njoku is just like you said, where he's drafted, he's fine. I just don't think we're getting anything close to what we saw last year.
27, 26, 17, 17 fantasy points over the last 4 games of the season. Again, I think the Evan Ingram parallel is there. And much like Evan Ingram, you're not paying a jacked up price for David Njoku based on the end of last season, right? And I almost wish we were, because then there'd be more value later in the board. People are being surprisingly rational with both of these tight ends. And yeah, I think you're right. Calling David Njoku and Evan Ingram floor plays, it sounds insulting. It's not. I think that's the right way to look at it. Brock Bowers, tight end 11, going about pick 105 right now at the NFFC. I can't decide how many pieces of this Raiders offense I'm willing to invest in. I have a fair amount of Jacoby Myers. I think there's some upside there, especially if they were to trade Devontae Adams midseason. All of a sudden, Jacoby Myers is likely your wide receiver 1 for what could be, more than half of the year. I've been excited about how they've used Brock Bowers. We've seen him, for a few series in the preseason. He's playing fullback. He's playing tight end. He's split in the slot. He's split out wide. That's a really good sign, because I think coming out of the draft, this team just took Michael Mayer in round 2 last year, arguably the best tight end in the 2023 draft. Now they take, one of the best tight end prospects in a long time in Bowers. And of course, the messaging out of Vegas has been, we're going to see both of them on the field. I think that's true. And I think part of the way they're going to make that work is not just running a ton of 12 personnel, but moving Brock Bowers all over the field. The question is, how does that translate to fantasy?
Well, first of all, Luke Getsy comes in, he coached with the Bears, and it was a heavy 12 personnel team, 2 tight ends on the field. So when they drafted Bowers, a lot of the fans thought, they just took the best player available. No, they brought in Getsy, and you're going to run 2 tight end sets. Yep. That's the way it is. And the nice thing about the NFL, we say it earlier in the show, 73% zone defense. You don't want to send the same player out. You're right. Bowers may be weaponized, but don't think that Mayer's not going to see any targets here, right? Because you want to confuse the defense. And if a defense is overplaying a side, you've got really 2 chess pieces at tight end, and that's going to be a very good component for attack. But ultimately, it comes down to this. We learned a lot about Antonio Pierce, the head coach last year. They want to play defense, and they really do have an emerging defense. They could be very good, and they want to run the ball, and they do have a good offensive line, and they definitely could road grade a bit too. And so what I think is going to happen, remember the Christmas Day game against the Chiefs? Yep. They got out to a lead, and they took the air out of the ball. They sat on it for 3 quarters, hardly threw it at all. And if there are 5 or 6 games this year where they are going to get a lead, you're not going to see them pass, and they have bad quarterbacks. So I'm trying to avoid the receivers in this game altogether, because I think there's going to be a lot of lean weeks where we see 120 passing yards and we see 200 rushing yards out of the backfield.
So in your mind, and based on what you just said, I think I may know the answer. Is there Dalton Kincaid, Sam Laporta upside for Brock Bowers in year 1? Because you're paying a higher price for Brock Bowers than you were for either of those players last year, and you could argue that they were in significantly better situations.
There's no offense that wants to have Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell airing it out. That's not going to happen. I mean, there'll be a couple games you're getting blown out, and they might have to, but that's going to be the exception and not the rule. So I don't think Bowers has anywhere in the neighborhood of the upside of the other players. Like Kincaid has Josh Allen. He's going to throw the ball. That he's an alien. That guy's awesome. Yeah. They're going to throw. So I just don't think the offense is going to lend itself to being pass friendly.
All right, so beyond Brock Bowers, then we get into a tier of tight ends that nobody feels great drafting, whether it's Dallas Goedert, whether it's TJ Hawkinson, if you want to roll that dice, whether it's Pat Freiermuth, Dalton Schultz. These are higher end tight end 2s. If you really want to wait on tight end, you're probably okay with any of those names, but you're not feeling great about it. Of that group of 4, who have you found yourself clicking on most?
And you said Pat Freiermuth in this group.
Yeah, Goddard, Hawkinson, Freiermuth.
Yeah, first of all, Hawkinson, look, maybe people are drafting him are smarter than everybody else. But remember, the surgery wasn't done until January 26th. It's a 9-month injury, usually across the board. If he misses 9 months, that's Halloween. And he had no reps with Sam Darnold. And don't think that doesn't matter. It's not like you're going to walk in and say, okay, Hawkins, and all of a sudden you're going to have chemistry with your quarterback. That doesn't happen overnight. Freiermuth's the guy I'm targeting. So we saw last year, Kyle Pitts was used poorly, but Jonnu Smith wasn't. 582 yards. Well, Arthur Smith will run up to 80% heavy personnel. Well, they have Darnell Washington. He's almost, if you look at him, he's probably 300 pounds. He's not the 280 he's listed. He's going to be blocking. Freiermuth is the receiving option. Connor Hayward could catch a little bit, but Freiermuth is a legitimate receiver. And there are always targets in the Arthur Smith offense. Go back to the Tennessee days. Jonnu Smith played there. Delaney Walker, highly productive, a lot of targets. In the Atlanta days, we were seeing 141 tight end targets in 2021. And then 2022 was weird because Kyle Pitts got hurt and they had Michael Pruitt. So it was only 80 targets. But last year, 160 tight end targets in Atlanta. Now, Freiermuth's not getting 140 targets, but he could easily get 110 targets in this offense because he's the weapon and he will be on the field all the time. So, yes, I think he is going to be a very good fantasy performer.
All right, we got a Michael Pruitt reference. We could check that box off, Jim. When it comes to Freiermuth, does it matter to you who's ultimately at quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers? I think it's going to be Russell Wilson to start the year. I don't think it's going to be Russell Wilson to finish the year. Does the specter of Justin Fields matter to you? I mean, we saw him support Cole Kmet for much last season,
and at a very high level too. Kmet's had two good seasons.
Top 10 tight end last year.
Yes, and look, the types of passes and the routes that Freiermuth are going to run, they're safer routes. Those aren't dangerous throws. Those are throws that really, even like a guy like Daniel Jones can make those throws. I have no issue that Fields can make those throws. Russell Wilson can make them. So no, I think based on the type of player and the way he's used, no, this is not going to be a problem at all.
All right, let's talk, I wouldn't say long shots, but, darts that you're firing at the end of a draft. If you're in a deeper league, maybe you're looking at a tight end 3. A lot of these guys can end up being your tight end 2. We're talking Taysom Hill, Cole Kmet, Luke Musgrave, Tyler Conklin, Isaiah Likely. You can get into Cade Otton. That's kind of where the cutoff is for me. Cade Otton would be the last tight end I would really want to roster and feel reasonably okay about. When you start firing darts later in drafts, where have you been leaning?
I do like Luke Musgrave. I think there's going to be volatility because they have so many receivers in that offense. I don't. Yeah. Well, so here's the thing with Tucker Kraft. I want to point this out. So Musgrave gets hurt last year in week 12, and then Musgrave had been playing 45 to 60 snaps a game. And then people will say, all right, well, Musgrave came back in week 18 and then the 2 playoff games, and he only averaged 14 snaps. He wasn't right. They rushed him back. Kraft is the blocker. He was always going to be the blocker. He will always be the blocker. He'll get a couple of targets. Luke Musgrave is a legitimate receiving weapon. We've seen them line him up as the ISO X receiver. They detach from the formation. They'll stack their receivers on the right, Musgrave alone on the left. He is a dynamic route runner who can win in many different ways. He's a weapon that Matt LaFleur is going to utilize. And so I'm glad you brought about Tucker Kraft. Again, he's the blocker, and that's why Musgrave is going as tight end 17. Now, his ceiling is probably tight end 11. That's a ceiling if everything goes right. Yep. But otherwise, I do think he's around tight end 13, 14, and it's better than his ADP. If you need a second tight end, it works.
Any concerns for you with Cole Kmet as far as the workload split, the rumors out of Chicago that they're perhaps going to use Gerald Everett? I have a hard time believing Gerald Everett would end up being the guy ahead of Cole Kmet, but I could almost see this being like one of those running back timeshares that we love so much. Yeah,
we know that Shane Waldron's going to run 2 tight end sets. He did it in Seattle. He had 3 tight ends. He rotated them. And when the Bears brought in Everett, it's real simple. Cole Kmet can block. Gerald Everett cannot block. So when they're in that set, you can't put Everett in a blocking formation. That means Cole Kmet's stuck there. So he's in a bad spot. Yeah. So Everett's going to get those looks because, and all he's going to do is he may not even get a lot of targets, but Everett's just going to occupy the seam. And when he occupies the seam, that's something the defense has to be cognizant of while you're working DJ Moore or you're working Rome Dunes or you're working in Keenan Allen. So I just think, Cole Kmet's going to be a victim of circumstance. He's a wonderful player. I just don't see a scenario where he gets significant targets.
Isaiah Likely, the only backup tight end who I really consider drafting, Jim, and I almost consider it like a running back handcuff. If I take Mark Andrews in round 4, round 5, I don't mind circling back and taking Isaiah Likely in the 14th or the 15th round. Do you agree with that strategy? Is he kind of the only tight end that you would consider a true handcuff if Mark Andrews were to go down?
It is just so hard to roster a second tight end and knowing the bye weeks are coming and knowing you're going to have to go to the waiver wire. And if Andrews doesn't get hurt in the first 4 or 5 weeks, and again, other than last year, he doesn't miss time, rarely. So I get the point. And if you have a really, really deep league and you can bury a roster spot, it makes sense. I just don't see the ability of holding him through the bye weeks. And I'm worried about Likely. They're talking him up. But remember, this offense, when they're at their best, Patrick Ricard is on the field, and he's considered a running back, although he's everything but that. But that means there's not a second tight end on the field. And so that means, and remember, it was like 9 of 11 games with Andrews, Likely had less than 10 yards. And I just don't see a world where they're going to change their entire offense to fit him in, because that offense was working at a beautiful level last year and it was improving. And like you said, as a handcuff, if you can roster, justify roster spot, I get it, but it's going to be tough.
That's more of a thought in, like you said, a deeper league, an NFFC type of league. If you're doing a, I don't know, 14 round home league draft, you probably don't need to be rostering 3 tight ends. I would take Isaiah Likely as my third. It's essentially an insurance policy on Mark Andrews. We'll finish up with Noah Fant. He's somebody that he's a tight end 24 right now. He goes outside the top 200 on average, not even taken in every draft right now at the NFFC. And again, these are deep leagues. But Seattle's kind of cleared out the glut of like white long-haired tight ends that have occupied that position over the last few years. No more Colby Parkinson, no more Will Dissly. Is there a world in which Noah Fant is one of these guys who, again, is going undrafted in a lot of deeper leagues? Is he somebody that can emerge as a borderline top 15 tight end?
Look, Noah Fant was in Denver a few years ago, and when Noah Fant was there, he was the lead tight end. And it wasn't like he was a great shakes, but in his last 2 seasons in Denver, he had 90 targets in each season. He was right about 670 yards. The touchdowns were low, but the team wasn't scoring any points. Noah Fant is a very athletic tight end, and if the Seahawks are going to spread the field like we know they are with the 3 receiver sets, there's going to be room for Fant in the seam, and he can run. So yes, and really, like these NFFC leagues and FFPC, he is going up the boards, Noah Fant. People are realizing this is a potential steal and a weapon. So get him while you can. But if it's a second tight end, definitely roster him.
He's a tight end 12 just a couple of years ago, Jim. And I think you look at the numbers from last season, you're like, boy, 32 catches, 43 targets. I think it's going to put people off the scent a little bit more than it should. I think we're not factoring in, how much attrition there's been at that position for Seattle. And you look at some of the other names in that range. I mean, I have no interest in Hunter Henry, who's going ahead of Noah Fant on average. Jonnu Smith is semi-interesting to me just because of the mysterious upside of the Miami offense. But we've also seen that team just not really do anything in terms of fantasy for tight ends over the last few years. A lot of people are in on Ben Sinnott as kind of a late round play in Washington. You could talk me into that in a deeper league. Probably not somebody I'm going to be drafting in most leagues, somebody to keep an eye on the waiver wire early on. But any other deep names that you're keeping an eye on before we get out of here?
Quietly, Juwan Johnson came off the PUP list. He had that foot surgery and they were worried about him. And Juwan Johnson, look, 2 years ago, he had a nice stretch of 7 games. Last year down the stretch, he played well. And ultimately, they're in a new offense with a lot of play action. And Derek Carr's going to have to get the ball out. And when it's not Olave short, I'm telling you, the tight end position is going to be utilized out of necessity. And I do think Juwan Johnson is very good, very athletic. And I think he's a sneaky tight end too.
All right, that'll do it for our full tight end preview. Go check out all of our positional previews. We've run through quarterbacks, running backs, receivers, and now tight ends over these last couple of days. It's been great hanging out at Circa. We want to thank Circa. We want to thank our guy, Aaron Oster, who joined us on the XM show last night. Fantastic weekend out here. They always do a great job hosting us. We do our annual RotoWire trip out here in July. We love coming out here for contest weekend. If you're listening live, if you're listening to this as a podcast, go sign up for Circa Million. Go sign up for Circa Survivor. You got to sign up in Vegas, but you can play from anywhere. We want to thank Circa, the presenting sponsor of this pod. We also want to thank Fantrax. We want to thank Fantasy Sports Knockout as well. Jim, we are less than 2 weeks away from NFL Week 1. Great chatting with you. Looking forward to doing it again soon.
All right, let's get at it. Happy drafting, everyone.